Hello and welcome to World Bank Live. I'm Paul Blake. We're continuing to take stock of the coronavirus's impact on all aspects of global development this morning and highlighting the work that our colleagues are doing to respond to that crisis. Of course, in the short term, efforts around the world have been primarily focused on the health response. But as the crisis has evolved, many are starting to think about what a sustainable and resilient recovery will look like. Well, this morning, I'm very happy to be joined by one such person. Bernice van Bronckhorst is the Global Director for Climate Change here at the World Bank, and she joins us live from her home in Washington, D.C. Bernice, thank you so much for taking the time this morning.
No, thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me on this morning.
It's our pleasure. Let's jump right into it. We've got a lot to talk about. So obviously, much of the focus of the World Bank and the global response of governments and communities has been on tackling the health crisis, the immediate needs of the health crisis. But we're beginning to see plans for the future, for the recovery phase of this crisis. Do you get a sense that, governments and organizations are thinking about, that recovery phase just yet and what that will look like?
Absolutely. So first of all, yes, the bank is now supporting COVID-related response activities, financing them in over 100 countries. So we're really ramping up our support. And of course, as you say, the first response has really been on the health crisis, just to make sure that health systems don't get overwhelmed, that health personnel have the right equipment, etc., everything that they need to be able to respond to the pandemic. But beyond that, there's already been a really quick thinking around, obviously, how do we help the most vulnerable in societies? How do we get cash into the hands of those people that have lost their jobs? In particular, again, the most poor and the most vulnerable in many of our client countries. So a lot of thinking around that. But knowing that that's the first wave, we also know there's a second wave of support coming. So we're starting to think really about, okay, what does the economic recovery, the economic stimulus packages look like? What will they look like as they start getting rolled out over the next few months, 6 months, 12 months? And with that in mind, and thinking of the billions of dollars that just the World Bank is setting aside for this response, but of course the trillions of dollars, if you look globally, what's being set aside for this economic stimulus. And we're really starting to think about what can we do in terms of bringing sustainability and principles of climate change into this stimulus response, so that we don't lose, to some extent, almost an opportunity to do some good, silver lining in the light of this pandemic. So we are definitely starting to think about it. We're starting to talk about it with our clients, and of course not just within the World Bank, but with many partners outside as well.
You talked there about, bringing sustainability into the stimulus that will come after. Let's explore that idea of sustainability a little bit and what it means in the context of a recovery from a global pandemic like this. In the most immediate sense, what are we talking about here? I think I've heard your colleagues and you talk in the past about, building resilient healthcare services. Can you explain that a little bit? And for folks who don't know, what is meant by that?
So I think what we're meaning by that, and we're drawing really very much on a lot of experience that we've had over the years in responding to natural disasters and climate-induced disasters. So it's really thinking about what are some of these social protection systems, for example, that you can use, adaptive social safety nets, that you can use in a moment of crisis. Make sure that they are responsive to that crisis, that they are resilient in the sense that they work during and right after the crisis. So what we're seeing in the pandemic, for example, is that we can really channel a lot of what we call, cash support, conditional cash transfer programs, where we get money straight into the hands of those that need it the most. So we're drawing a lot of lessons from that kind of work that we've done in the past. So whether it's a post-earthquake or a post-hurricane or a pandemic situation, we can bring a lot of our understanding and our experience on what resilience looks like and preparedness for those kinds of events into the program that we're doing right now. So that's one. The other thing that I just wanted to also highlight, and again, bringing back a little bit our natural disaster experience, is that we're quite worried at the moment also that, of course, the climate-related disasters won't stop, right? We know that the hurricane season in the Caribbean is only a few weeks off. And what's going to happen to countries where we see the risk of what we call compound risk, where you have a pandemic ongoing, where countries are already suffering, where maybe the tourism industry is completely shut down. What will happen when there is a hurricane? They've already, most of them have already used all of their contingent financing options So it's a concern, and it's that compound risk that we're also really looking at in terms of the immediate resilience. Just a couple of examples.
It's interesting, that compound risk. And, I think a couple of weeks ago here in the U.S., there was some tornadoes that came through one part of the U.S. and it made the relief and recovery efforts so much more complicated. The pandemic made those relief and recovery efforts so much more complicated. So there's that, compounding you're talking about there. But let's just take a quick moment, Bernice, and we'll pause for a second because there's a bunch of people joining us online. If you're just joining us, this is World Bank Live. We see people tuning in from around the world. We see Grace from Kenya, Sangita from Bangladesh, Mohammed in Morocco, and Pilar in Colombia. Welcome to you guys and everyone else who's tuning in around the world. We have Bernice von Bronckhorst here. She's the Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank, live with us this morning, and we're looking ahead to the future, specifically to the recovery after the COVID-19 crisis passes, or as it starts to pass, and how we can make it resilient and sustainable. So Bernice, I just want to go next to explore the medium to long term there. As I said, we're trying to look a little bit out to the future. We're expecting, this global lockdown to have a severe impact on the economy, on jobs. Many governments have passed or, planning various stimulus measures, stimulus packages, increase spending to help kickstart the economy, help the vulnerable, and to protect jobs. People need to feel the effects of this now, but how could decisions on this spending now have a longer term impact, over the next few months, over the next few years?
So thanks, Paul. So this is the big question at the moment that we're reading a lot of op-eds about, and a lot of people are thinking about this around the world. But the idea is really that, I think, to begin with, that whatever the spending gets spent on, we have this do no harm principle first and foremost. So we're looking at we have some colleagues at the bank who came up with what we call a sustainability checklist, which is really a quick screening tool. So if you start looking at projects that you might be starting to, or programs that you might start to think of funding through the stimulus programs, that you can do a quick check, like, what does it mean in terms of sustainability? What does it mean first of all, what does it mean in terms of jobs? Who are you reaching? Who are you supporting? Does it reach the most vulnerable? Is it fast enough? Is it going to have an immediate impact or a medium-term impact? But then secondly, really starting to look at, what are the potential impacts on natural capital, on human capital, on sustainability, and indeed on some of our longer-term climate change objectives. So is it investing in resilient development? Is it investing in longer-term decarbonization pathways? So by using that checklist, you can start sort of screening through all the different proposals that are obviously, being lobbied at governments as we speak by all kinds of different industries and interest groups. But you try and sort of narrow it down to make it something that hopefully will also, serve to our longer term objectives in terms of sustainable development and the sustainable development goals. So a lot of thinking is going on around that, and a lot of work. And yes, it's a little bit, it's hard, again, I said it earlier, we don't want to think of it as an opportunity. It's really more of a silver lining. But if you think of the huge amount of investment that we're expecting to go out in the next year, it's really absolutely critical, like a once in a generation opportunity to get it right. And if we don't get it right, the potential downside is also very, very serious. And of course, we can, think back of some previous crises where perhaps we haven't always gotten it right, and learn lessons from that as well.
And it's interesting, that sort of almost like sustainability litmus test you're talking about there. You talked a little bit about this in your answer just now, but can you give us some examples of how investments now could boost sustainability in different areas?
So you can start with some really basic things in terms of some of the programs that I talked to you before, like the adaptive social safety nets or cash for work programs, just right now to really immediately support the needs of the poorest of the poor in some of our client countries. So I'll give an example of a project in Pakistan that the World Bank has been funding for a while now. We've done a quick restructuring of the project to use the undispersed balance to pay poor rural folks to reforest, to plant trees. And that's a quick way. So they get money. At the same time, we are obviously already investing in reforestation and in increased sustainability, which will have greater payoffs in the future. So that's a sort of immediate term thing that you can start thinking of, payment for eco services, etc., that can have that sort of win-win, where you both address the immediate crisis, but you also build in sustainability objectives in the longer term. And then, of course.
Sorry, feel free to go on.
So anyway, no, I was starting to think more medium term. There's obviously thinking around, what kind of industry should we build out, for example. So I know I was reading in the newspaper just the other day that in Europe, they're starting to look at, well, you can do a bailout of, say, the car industry that is suffering or the airlines, but maybe you do that in return for saying, well, maybe you need to have, tighter emission standards or, be on a pathway for lower carbon air travel, for example. So you can start building in those kinds of objectives, even in the sort of short and medium term responses and stimulus programs that you roll out. So that's the kind of things that we're starting to look at, also as we work with our clients in developing countries.
And you talked about projects a bit there. That's a perfect segue for the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, it's still kind of early days in the crisis in a lot of countries around the world. But, my understanding is it can take a long time to get projects up and running. Is there a way that you guys can sort of get these projects and get these ideas going quicker to respond to this crisis?
Yes, so I think, again, you're right. Particularly the larger infrastructure projects tend to take quite a long time to prepare. And it's important, again, if you think of sort of big public works type programs that are often used in stimulus programs, again, to get that resilience and that sustainability aspect right, it's important that you start a little bit earlier often. And maybe, and it's important to start now, even if it's a program that we're only going to be funding in, say, 12 months or 18 months from now. So absolutely. Having said that, there are some, existing plans out there that we can draw upon. So for instance, we're part of it's called the NDC partnership. It's an international group of institutions and bilaterals that work to support countries enhance and implement their NDCs. And those are the nationally determined commitments to the Paris Agreement. But if you start going through these NDCs, you'll actually find that there are a list of ready projects that we can finance that are climate friendly, that are actually already have been identified to support countries' objectives under the Paris Agreement. So by going through some of these kinds of plans, we can start screening quickly out some of these projects that are what we call shovel ready, and we can get them out very quickly. So that's one way of doing it. The other way that we're talking about is to come up with really quickly some technical assistance for governments so that they can get this kind of preparation done faster. So through technical assistance, through consultants, through support, again, through multilaterals such as ourselves, but it could also be through bilaterals, the UN system, etc. But there's a lot of thinking around that as well. How we can ramp that up quickly so that we don't lose this opportunity because we don't have a lot of time before.
So leaning on a lot of kind of the relationships, the professional relationships and the expertise that's out there to find some of these shovel-ready projects and kind of get them going for that sustainable recovery, I think is kind of what I'm hearing you say there.
Right, and they can be very simple things. I mean, again, it doesn't need a lot of big expertise. If you think of a lot of cities around the world already have plans lying around of sort of increasing bike lanes. Well, this is a great time to start funding those projects and put them into practice, or how to rapidly expand your charging capacity for electronic vehicles, for example. So those are the kinds of projects that are often already ready. They've been prepared. They've been thought through, and this is a good moment to pick them up with stimulus financing. So those are the kinds of examples that would be.
And just briefly, what are some of the criteria that you would use to sort of judge these existing projects and whether they are good to go ahead?
I mean, we would use the regular, you do due diligence on the technical specifications, on obviously, I think, the World Bank has a whole way of preparing programs that have to be consulted with the community, etc. So we would make sure that all of that, has properly been taken care of before we jump in head along. But then secondly, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the sustainability checklist would be sort of a first sort of screening way to start looking at it.
I'm wondering if you can give me some historical context here. I think there's a lot of comparisons in terms of the economic crisis that has been born out of COVID-19. There's been a lot of comparisons to the 2008 global financial crisis and the recovery after that, and a lot of people trying to look at what lessons could be learned. Did countries sort of consider a sustainable recovery and sustainable investments in the wake of that crisis as they were kind of planning and managing their recovery?
My sense is, so yes, you can find some good examples, and Korea is a very good, the Republic of Korea is a very good example where they early on invested in green stimulus, green recovery with some really great results. But I would say on the whole, most countries didn't. And I think that's probably why, if you look now, there's such a robust debate going around it, particularly in, around the world, I would say, not just in Europe and North America, but really sort of taking those lessons learned so that you don't necessarily, bail out the old, dirty businesses as usual, but really be a little bit more creative and start thinking, putting a green and a sustainable lens on everything. So a lot of lessons were learned. A lot of money was, again, you can take the car industry. A lot of, stimulus funding at the time went to bailing out the car industry. Perhaps that was a lost opportunity looking back, thinking, well, maybe we could have done that in return for, as I mentioned earlier, tighter emissions standards, etc. So thinking through what that could mean is important. And I think we're doing a lot more of that now than we did in 2008.
Bernice, just stay with me 1 second. We'll take another quick pause here just to welcome all the folks who are tuning in from around the world. You're with World Bank Live. It's just gone 11:15 a.m. here on the East Coast in the U.S. We have Bernice von Bronckhorst, the World Bank's Global Director for Climate, on the line, and she's talking us through steps that can be taken to ensure a sustainable and resilient recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. We see people tuning in from around the world. I got a list here. Alan from Uganda, Marlene from Mexico, Laxmi from Nepal, Vania from Bulgaria, Carlos in Peru, Erman in Turkey. Welcome to you all, and welcome to everyone else out there. Bernice, I just want to turn back to you now. As we start to sort of wind down this program here, I wanted to ask, do you see this crisis as an opportunity for us to sort of build back better, build back stronger than what the sort of world and economy we had before the crisis?
Well, that is, I think, the hope. No, so that's what we've been talking about for the last 15, 20 minutes, and that's really very much when you hear in the news and we hear in the media around, green recovery, green stimulus. That is very much what we're hoping to see. Now, it's not easy, and we need to put our thinking caps on quickly, but that's exactly what we're hoping to see. So again, taking advantage of what is a very tragic and incredibly difficult global crisis, but maybe trying to turn that to some extent to our advantage when we move forward in terms of seeing more green and sustainable investments. So one of the things that we're doing, for example, right now, we envisage a lot of our lending over the next year or so is going to be less in direct investment of projects and more into budget support to governments, what we call development policy lending. And we're really trying to think about how do we get climate-informed development policy loans? How do we get sustainability included and mainstreamed in development policy lending? So that kind of budget support, stimulus lending that goes out, again, has these principles embedded in it. And, things like, maybe this is a good time to start thinking about fossil fuel subsidy reform. And can you embed that when we do budget support to governments? Maybe we need to think about other types of policy reforms that can help support, say, renewable energy in the future. So again, making sure that these kinds of programs principles are embedded in the development policy lending programs that we're looking at over the next year or so. So yes, it is an opportunity. I hate to use the word opportunity because it sounds a bit tone deaf in the current situation. Obviously, we're still looking at, a health crisis. Our main concern is saving lives. And our second concern is helping people, saving their livelihoods. But then really, can we do that at the same time as thinking about longer term sustainability and meeting our climate change objectives?
And trying to create some positive outcomes from a pretty bad situation overall.
At the very minimum, we don't want to do harm and move back, right, from where we were. So, yeah.
So just as we wrap up here, my understanding is that you and your team are hosting some events on the green recovery all next month during the month of June. For folks who may be interested, who want to learn more, can you just fill us in a little bit on that and tell us how they can tune in, how they can learn more?
Okay, so I'm not the expert here, but yes, there's a whole program of events that's been put together. There's going to be a number of these kinds of live chats, discussions, webinars that are going to be happening, I believe, from 10 to 11 in the morning. So again, this is DC time, so Eastern Standard Time, but again, open for everyone to join in, bringing in both World Bank expertise, but a lot of experts from outside of the World Bank, working in academia, in other governments. So the idea is to have a lot of brainstorming and thinking through, again, a lot of the things that we've talked about here today, and how we can get this quickly embedded in our response, in our work with our clients in the countries that are affected the most. So yes, all throughout the month of June, go to our website. It's the climate change page on the World Bank website, and we'll have a whole schedule of events right there. There will be some op-eds and some other things that we're rolling out, but the idea is to keep the attention very much focused on this, not just the climate change group, but the sustainability vice presidency as a whole. So watch that space.
Sounds good to me. And as you said, there are people who want to learn more. They can head over to the climate section of the World Bank website. I'm sure they can also check out the WBG_climate Twitter account, where it'll all be, as Bernice was just saying, a whole bunch of events coming up in June looking at this idea of sustainable recovery. Bernice, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule this morning. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Paul. Have a good day.
You too. Bernice von Bronckhorst is the Global Director for Climate Change here at the World Bank. She joined us from her home in the Washington, D.C. area. A quick programming note for you: on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern U.S. Daylight Time, which is 3 p.m. GMT, we'll be taking a look at another crisis that is unfolding alongside the COVID-19 crisis, and that is the locust plague that is ravaging parts of the Middle East and Africa. It's going to be a great discussion about an important topic. I hope you'll be able to tune in. If you can't, that's okay too. You'll be able to watch that program as well as this one and all the other programs we've been producing over the past few weeks. Just head on over to live.worldbank.org. And if you're interested in learning more about the World Bank and the work that the World Bank does to respond to coronavirus and a number of other global issues, head on over to worldbank.org/coronavirus. In the meantime, stay healthy and stay safe, and we'll see you back here hopefully on Thursday. Goodbye.